How do we actually know when the Gospels were written? With difficulty. But it is not impossible. First off, all mythicists are non-scholarly and wrong. Jesus existed. We can infer that from two bedrock facts about him. 1, he was crucified. 2, shortly after his death by crucifixion, Jesus was proclaimed risen by his followers. Elaborating on these two bedrock facts, we can discover that Jesus died sometime on or around 30 Common Era. From that, we can determine also that the Gospels must have been written after 30 Common Era. Omitting probable earlier allusions, the earliest, most convincing quotations of the Gospels are found in the writings of Justin Martyr around 150 Common Era. Justin refers to certain documents he quotes from as the Memoirs of the Apostles. He never calls them Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, but we can see that his quotations correspond beautifully with the Synoptic Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke. In at least two places, Justin Martyr alludes to John, indicating that he knows that text also. Going by this, the Gospels could not have been written after 150 Common Era or before 30 Common Era. So we have a window of 120 years. That's quite a window. Can we narrow it further? Well, we can narrow it further. If it is true that the Gospels are based on oral traditions that had been in circulation about Jesus, not just in Palestine, where Aramaic was the spoken language, but also outside of Palestine, in the Greek-speaking Mediterranean world, the language the Gospels were written in, then that must have taken some time. Second-wave Judean followers of Jesus surely had information about Jesus' words. For example, the tradition common to both Matthew and Luke called Q, sayings now found in the so-called Gospel of Thomas, perhaps a collection of Jesus' parables. Not only Jesus' words would have been collected, but also his wondrous deeds. For example, a collection of anecdotes about Jesus' marvels. This information was largely in the form of memorized verbal lists, either to be cherished as a keepsake from the first wave, still largely in control of Judean and Galilean Jesus groups, or ignored as irrelevant in the light of second-wave reinterpretations and recontextualizations triggered by Jesus group experience outside of Judea and Galilee. Looking closely at the second-wave Jesus groups, we encounter Paul and his clients. Paul wrote his 7 authentic letters, which make up the earliest New Testament literature, in the 50s Common Era, and he was dead by the mid-60s. Paul traveled widely throughout the Mediterranean and established a number of Jesus groups composed of Hellene or civilized Israelite émigrés in major urban centers. Shockingly, Paul almost never quotes Jesus. He simply isn't interested in Jesus' sayings or mighty deeds. Importantly for our purpose here, Paul gives no indication that he had ever heard that there were Gospels about Jesus. Could it be that Paul knew about these Gospels, but just chose to ignore them in his letters? This is very unlikely, for several reasons. A major one is discussed in the companion video to this presentation. Gospels are for grandchildren. You should really watch it after this video. So with all this understood, please forget about the Gospels being composed in the months following Jesus' death and resurrection. It was almost certainly decades after. Since the Gospels were likely unknown in the 50s, when Paul was active, our window narrows to no earlier than 60 Common Era. Except for non-scholarly conservative Catholics and other Christians, basically fundamentalists of various stripes, the document we call Mark was likely the first canonical Gospel written, and is a third-wave Jesus group composition. But when exactly was Mark written? Was it composed before or after the Judean war with Rome, culminating in the destruction of the Temple Urban Center, Jerusalem, in 70 Common Era? Likely, Mark was written afterward. Why? Well, look at the comments in Mark chapter 13 about how the temple will be destroyed. Does this indicate that Mark lived after the fact? Maybe. Mark is vague about the temple's destruction. Or it could be that his descriptions of the destruction of Jerusalem were left vague because he's writing from somewhere way outside Palestine and has only heard rumors of what happened there. Matthew and the earliest version of John were third-wave documents, written after Mark. The final version of John, with its appended chapter 21, was composed after its Jesus group had become an anti-society, sometime around 100 Common Era, in the fourth wave. The document we call Luke also was a fourth wave document. There is no convincing argument that claims John knew about the Synoptic Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke. But Matthew and Luke knew Mark for sure, even if they never read each other's respective texts. Both these Synoptic Gospels were dependent on Mark for many of their stories, and so they must have been written later, after Mark. How much later? Again, the companion video to this one, The Gospels Are for Grandchildren, helps clarify matters. Additionally, we can say that it is pretty clear that the documents we call Matthew and Luke were written after 70 Common Era. Both of these documents refer to the destruction of Jerusalem. All four canonical Gospels were evidently composed sometime between 70 Common Era and 150 Common Era. Why do so many scholars claim that they were all composed between 70 and 100 Common Era, a mere 30 years? It is because of possible allusions to them found in extra-biblical works like the Didache, written around 100 Common Era. One could also cite the letters of Ignatius of Antioch, but that would assume that Ignatius wrote his letters around 110. There are convincing arguments that the figure known as Ignatius actually lived and wrote decades after this. Short and sweet, there is a great deal of complicated arguing going on even now. One more thing about John. In its final anti-language form with chapter 21 attached, it certainly appears to be the final gospel written. Could it come from the early 2nd century? Maybe. But many scholars are convinced that the highly edited version of John we have in our Bibles was written sometime in the 90s. The reason is because it belongs to an anti-society reeling in bitterness from the Judean rejection of the gospel, easily located in time, and this gospel does not address later docetic controversies about Jesus, as does Ignatius of Antioch. Thus, this later version of John comes after the Synoptics, but before Ignatius of Antioch. Thus, it was probably written near the close of the 1st century. Now, all of these are scholarly guesstimations. They're all probability judgments. They are all reasonable, but not exact or precise.